18. Act tries to provide loans to farmers. Market information on farmers' crops. Succession reflects progress. So when you become proficient in one thing and it naturally pushes you into another venture, everyone becomes interested. This was the importance of bridging data gaps and organizing the price data of local domestic crops. In our time, it was easy to find data on the major export items such as banana, cocoa, and nutmeg. For the crops that were traded in the local fresh produce markets, very little was available in terms of a valid price series. It wasn't the case that the data was not collected. Prices in the Port of Spain wholesale market were being recorded, but the marketing board did absolutely nothing with this data. We therefore offered to receive the weekly data from them, organize it into a series, and return it to them. The process was so successful that soon we were putting out forecasts for what farmers of local crops could expect within the coming weeks. In those days, farmers used to plan their production on current price levels. If the price of tomatoes was high, you would find a lot of farmers deciding to go into tomatoes, only to find the price falling when all of their harvests came into the market 3 months later. Alternatively, if a farmer was having problems getting a good price for his cucumbers, he was sure not to replant that crop in the next cycle. With the data we had accumulated from the wholesale market over some years, we started getting access to their earlier records. We were able to create seasonal price indices, which told us how the prices were likely to perform during the rainy and dry season. My World Bank research into filling data gaps ushered in a decade in which my struggle now was to avoid becoming buried in numeracy. Act outreach was not enough. Between 1987 and 1990, ACT was involved in a program on lending to small farmers in Trinidad and Tobago. Up to that time, ACT's modus operandi was to identify a technical problem in small farms that it could help solve and then seek the means to finance its own involvement. In that way, our technical support would be at no external expense to the farmer. Of course, they would have to bear the internal costs of expanding their production techniques, but at least our intervention was there to reduce the risks of failure. Towards the end of the 1980s, our support had been predominantly in terms of local market information. We had started producing seasonal indices of farmers' fresh produce in the wholesale market and guiding farmers to plan production to overcome the seasonal highs and lows. The seasonal price fluctuations moved in sync with the rains, so to achieve greater higher yields in the dry season, one had to manage one's crop with all the best known techniques of mulching, pest disease control, and other techniques to maintain more moisture in the soil. This is where my knowledge of organic farming made an invaluable contribution. It was all working out nicely. Although agriculture may be seen as a rural enterprise, it was never too far from the concern in the international community. The simple fact was that farming was about food. In the 1970s, the emerging food policy framework identified the need for several mutually supportive national and international policies to strengthen the autonomy and resilience of local food systems. If you talked to a Minister of Agriculture in the Caribbean, 9 out of 10 times he would have been advised to to adopt a posture of modernist development agenda where the corporate trust for monopoly control over the global food system signaled success. The implicit doctrine here was we cannot do it without the big seed companies, the big chemical companies, and the major food market chains. We were definitely not in agreement with this sentiment, and we had a leader in Michel Pimbert to rebut this kind of thinking. Michel was French, but he worked with the UK-based International Institute of Environment and Development, IIED, the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, ICRISAT, in India, the University François Rabelais de Tours in France, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature in Switzerland. In his IIED publication entitled Towards Food Sovereignty, Reclaiming Autonomous Food Systems, Michel Pimbert framed the debate perfectly. He showed that there was a direct relationship between the vast increases in productivity achieved through the use of automated technology, re-engineering, downsizing, and total quality management. That was one side of the equation. But wait for it. This also resulted in the permanent exclusion of high numbers of workers from employment in both industry and the service sector. In case you missed it, Michel was making the ever so subtle distinction in speaking of food sovereignty instead of food security. Michel provided specific examples and case study material to highlight some of the many practical ways in which local autonomous organizations can manage and oversee different links in the food chain from seed to plate. This included active roles for local organizations like ACT in sustaining diverse food systems, livelihoods, and environments. Such local organizations could become strategic in producing knowledge and innovation and in designing regulatory institutions that would positively impact on farmers' lives. Now you have to remember that ACT's outreach was structured within the perception that reclaiming strategic space for autonomy and development of persons in agriculture depended on strengthening the positive features of the local food system. We were in support of citizens' action grounded in an alternative theory of precipitating social change. Our motivation was to contribute to environmental sustainability, agricultural biodiversity, and proven methods of sustaining production in both low external input and high input-output agriculture. This was a new trajectory in intervention in Caribbean agriculture. It was multifaceted and multi-purposed, using soil organic matter decomposition, nutrient recycling, pollination, pest control, yield functions, soil and water conservation, action on landscapes, rainfall harvesting, and climate adjustments. All of the boundary conditions had to be met. How ACT provided credit. One of the pitfalls of writing your own report card is that you need to be ever so careful to not only record the subjects in which you excelled. This project, that is, providing loans to small farmers, is one in which we would, at best, have earned a D-. We had argued that, with our technical know-how to make farms more productive, small farmers should be treated as good prospects for agricultural loans. As fortune would have it, the Inter-American Development Bank had hit on the idea of lending some of its funds to local organizations who had both direct contact and capacity to on-lend to small farmers who had no serious collateral base. This led to ACT borrowing $2 million from the bank for such a purpose. Let me say, while we were good on technical know-how, we turned out to be very poor in credit management affairs. In addition, the IDB swamped us with the same reporting protocols that they required from governments. So much so that the two university graduates that we had hired were stretched between technical support to farmers, monitoring and collecting on repayments, and in addition, reporting in detail to the IDB. We had another issue to contend with. So pervasive and disruptive was the culture of free money in Trinidad that we could not avoid attracting our portions of scammers. We had one case in which we were forced to repossess a fishing vessel and engine that we had financed when it was clear that the respondent was delinquent in spite of a proven ability to make payments. In another case, an extension officer from Sandy Grande even left his post to lead a group of young men to pretend that they were a farming group. Becoming suspicious of their motive, I decided to pay them a field visit and found them apparently hard at work fencing their supposedly plowed field. I doubled back to the site within 30 minutes and they had all disappeared. We had a system of paying supply shops directly for their inputs. One day, I turned up at the shop to claim the inputs that had supposedly been bought, with the owner telling me that they had not paid him for anything. Feeble attempt at political manipulation. Caribbean politicians tend to gravitate to scenes in which local constituents are recipients of huge sums of money. One of their worst mistakes is to think that all of their constituents are cut from the same cloth of dependence on political favors. My advice to young political novices in this profession is this: if you wish to tango with your constituents, find out first how well they can dance. Our loan arrangement with the IDB inadvertently exposed us to a very puerile attempt at political influence by persons who were the least experienced in acting this way. In December 1986, the NAR had won a resounding victory at the polls, and Lincoln Myers won an even more astounding victory by defeating the then Prime Minister Chambers in his constituency of St. Anne's East. Lincoln was then appointed Minister of Agriculture. I ran into Lincoln on the plane on his way back from Martinique, where he had taken a short vacation before assuming his new duties. I alerted him to the fact that our organization act was about to conclude negotiations with the IDB for a $2 million facility for on lending to small farmers. I also advised him that the only thing that he had to do was to send a letter of no objection to the IDB. This was the new protocol in such direct funding to NGOs. At the time we were about to receive our first tranche, the IDB country resident representative, ResRep, called and asked if we would consider having a representative of the ministry on the board of ACT to oversee the use of the funds. We refused, citing our long tradition of working outside of the realm of any government intervention. Soon the ResRep was repeating this request as if it were a condition for him to forward the loan application to head office. He made the error of threatening me with reporting my resistance to the new Minister of Agriculture. I countered by threatening him with reporting his apparent collusion with a member of a foreign government to hand over control of an IDB project to the latter. Then we received an invitation from Lincoln, our friendly minister, to attend a launching of our project at the minister's boardroom. We were confused. What was wrong with Lincoln? All he had to do was to sign a letter of no objection, not to launch our project. Anyway, we complied and found ourselves in this meeting with all of the top technical brass of the ministry. At that time, they called to themselves the Ministry of Food Production, Marine Exploitation, Forestry, and the Environment. The minister expressed his joy at seeing this negotiation to a final success. Really? He had nothing to do with our negotiation. He then asked me to explain to his staff how ACT intended to manage the fund. After delivering my spiel, he asked what role was the ministry expected to play. In order to make sure I was not condoning any conversations he may have held with the IDB res rep behind our backs, I promptly answered, none. The new minister exploded in anger. He said he was trying to sit silent while, I quote, the blood in my veins was about to burst. What on with this guy? He then wanted to know what the IDB thought of my statement. In a subdued tone, the res rep stated, Mr. Minister, I have confirmed with my headquarters that the IDB has no authority to impose any governance structures on loan recipients. Okay, that is where this was all coming from. I raised my hand and asked politely, Honorable Minister, may I speak? I was being very official as I did not want to be held accountable for such a young minister getting a heart attack in the meeting with ACT. He retorted, yes, go ahead and speak. In a slow drone, I said, Honorable Minister, if the cause of your blood pressure rise was from whatever this man, referring to Resrap, may have led you to believe, we could have prevented this if you had only asked us first. This man has no authority to stipulate how we at ACT run our business. None. The room went silent. I looked at the members of the technical staff sitting opposite me. Some of them, like the head of extension, who seemed to be stunned with his mouth open. I guess they had never witnessed a local unit speaking with such hostility towards a minister and a donor representative who was about to finance it. I was not going to let the IDB res rep use our project to rack up favors with a new minister of government. Not on our watch. The meeting was brought to a soft landing through the diplomatic skill of the permanent secretary, who summarized that the ministry would remain willing to help in any way that ACT desired. At that point, the Honorable Minister promptly retreated to his office. Success in failing. Our intentions may have been laudable, but the results were disastrous. Instead of accumulating a sizable amount of repayments of loans, create a recyclable loan fund, we soon ran completely out of funds. The IDB had to write us off as a bad debt. The failure of the IDB soft loan project with ACT had serious consequences. We continued to survive this debacle as an NGO for another 4 years. But around 1998, we ceased seeking funding for ACT's direct intervention with farmers and workers. Instead, most of our professional compatriots had shifted into the realm of professional consultancies. I was no exception. After 25 years of NGO existence, ACT was now on the block as a consulting firm. An interesting development followed. When we started ACT, there were no NGOs in the field of direct support to economic growth at the level of enterprises. The NGO community at that time comprised either professional associations like the Lawyers Association or the Institute of Surveyors or church-affiliated social groups. By 1990, this space was populated by an abundance of political operants, some with an unsolicited animosity to those of us who did not appear to have an appetite for pure political activism. I remember speaking at a study group organized by Louis Bertrand when one of these operants asked me if I did not feel any sense of guilt not giving back to society but just giving talks to the choir. I looked at him and asked him to tell me the last time he created wealth in this economy or helped someone to create wealth. He was totally lost for an answer and responded by saying, "Well, it depends on what you mean by wealth." When you have a life compass with major focus on creating strategic space, it is never difficult to justify your actions.